huge numbers of students are on the move in universities outside their home countries. UNESCO statistics show that in 2012, at least 4 million students went abroad to study. That's 2 out of 10 students globally. Now, I'm not going to do a thing on all the figures, but, and clearly, I mean, there is a lot of data. UNESCO provides a lot of data, and so does the OECD. And in my paper, when I write it up, I'll have all that information in it. But I don't want to really dwell on that at the moment. But what I do want to say is, just in terms of Australia, most of our students, almost all of our students actually, are from Asia, various parts of Asia. And I'll just run down to give you a quick sense of where they're all coming from. China, India, Malaysia, Vietnam, Nepal, Indonesia, Singapore, South Korea, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. And of those, roughly over 50% are from China. Monash University, where I study, has nearly 25% of our students are from overseas. So now, that sort of student mobility or student flow, along with the flow of staff, knowledges, curriculum and research, ideologies, images, imaginations, finance, feelings, fantasies, and the technologies that facilitate these mobilities have led scholars to understand the contemporary university in a range of ways. Some of them draw on Castells and look at space of flows and place of flows. Others draw on Arjun Appadurai and look at the global scapes of the cultural economy and talk about it as a space of scapes. I think of it as a place of global flows involving roots and roots, drawing there on the anthropologist Clifford, where he talks about roots, R-O-U-T-E-S, and R-O-O-T-S, and the confluence of those two things. Now, post-colonial scholars and critical geographers have entered this discussion of global flows to make the necessary point that even as they change, there are very important asymmetrical patterns of power to these particular flows, and they shouldn't be overlooked. So what they point to is the flow of students from poorer countries to richer countries, from the so-called third world to the so-called first, from the so-called, I'm saying so-called because all these terms are problematic, from the so-called global south to the global north, from the so-called east to the west. And very importantly for this paper, the flows tend to be from colonised countries, former colonised countries, to former colonising countries, or to the globally imperialist power of the USA with its Cold War history in Asia, or to these countries' satellites. And Australia is an obvious example of a satellite, currently of the USA, previously of Britain, and obviously it was a former colony of Britain. Now, certain flows attract much more research attention than do others. The flows of people attract more, and finance attract a lot more than do the flows of knowledge, the flows of image, the flows of fantasy, and the flows of emotion. Further, the focus in these particular sorts of studies tends to be much more on the flows than the actual impediments to them. Overall, not enough attention is paid to the intersections, not just between different flows, but also between flows and multiple modes of stasis. The intersections between flows, stasis and power relationships on different scales also require much more attention than they've received to date. So the aim of this paper is to try to make a contribution to studies of the contemporary university as a space of global flows and of stasis. And to do this, I want to offer this narrative, which is very up close and personal, of a group of international doctoral students from Asia who were working at Monash University, and who sought to decolonise knowledge. And I'll be explaining as I go what that means if some people aren't particularly aware of that term. in the paper, I foreground what we call power/knowledge geographies, emotional geographies, and the intersection between the two of these. In so doing, I'll highlight the forces for flow and the forces for stasis, and think about these in terms of, as I said, roots and roots. So I begin the story with a book. Strange to begin a story with a book in these days of social media. The book is called Asia as Method. It builds on Stuart Hall's notion of the West as method. Asia as Method towards de-imperialization. And it's written by a guy called Chen, who is a very widely recognised international cultural studies scholar who actually studied under Stuart Hall. I found this book in Singapore when I was doing some work there, and I took it back to Monash for a reading group and of graduate students, and I imagine we'd just have one session on it. It created a firestorm of interest amongst our international students. It resulted in ongoing reading groups, ongoing writing groups, ongoing seminars and presentations, presentations at national conferences, presentations at international conferences, and in the end, a edited collection which is called Asia as Method in Education Studies. And I think you had a little flyer in the brochure. We've got a flyer somewhere, haven't we? Yeah. And I'm going to get back to that project later, but first of all, I just want to say a few quick things about what Chen said in his book with regard to power knowledge geographies and emotional geographies. And this is a very truncated description, obviously. He argues that knowledge production in Asia is constantly either positively or negatively referencing the West. He says, in knowledge production in Asia, the West has been regarded as an opposing entity, a system of reference, an object from which to learn, a point of measurement, a goal to catch up with, an intimate enemy, and sometimes an alibi for serious discussion and action. And I think we can see a number of these different ways in which the West is referenced, or at least Asia is referenced, in a number of the different presentations we've had along the way. Now, the West has presented itself to the world as the most modern, most mature, most developed, most progressive, most scientific, most rational, most enlightened, and most civilised in terms of knowledge. And such views have travelled to the colonies, to colonised countries and former colonised countries, and impacted on the people who live there in ways that help them not only to understand how themselves in relation to the West, but also, when I say helped, I'm putting that in quotes, on how they felt about the colonisers themselves. Now, Chen identifies a number of different strategies of response to the West by previous and current post-colonial scholars, and it's incredibly significant and important work. However, what he also does is he engages very critically with this work and highlights a number of knowledge problems associated with work of post-colonial scholars as well. He identifies a range of different ways in which they do this. But one of them is to challenge Eurocentric and American-centric practices of thought. We've already had reference that, during the conference about the Anglo-American hegemony in terms of global knowledge production. The classic book there is by a very famous post-colonial historian called Chakrabarty, and his book is called Provincialising Europe, Post-Colonialism and a Critique of History. And he is part of the Subaltern Studies Centre in India, and there's any amount of fascinating work coming out of that particular space, at the same time as some very fascinating critical engagements with it. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about post-colonial scholarship, but because we don't have time. But what Chen insists on, which is in terms of Asia as method, is that post-colonial scholars are also obsessed with the West in one way or another. And he argues that they need to get beyond this obsession with this constant referencing the West as a primary reference point. And he makes the argument, and we can unpack these concepts in discussion if you want to, that one of the problems with this obsessive focus on the West is the problem of nationalism, which was a big problem in post-colonial movements, the problem of nativism, which is associated about authentic knowledges and indigenous cultures and so forth, and the problem of civilizationism. And he sees all these particular problems in post-colonial scholarship. He asserts the need for alternative mappings, the need to move the point of reference outside of such colonial frameworks, and he makes similar arguments about the conceptual frameworks that have arisen out of the Cold War and North American imperialism in Asia. And anyone who has any knowledge at all of the history of various parts of Asia will know the incredible significance of the Cold War and its implications for the history and geography of various parts of Asia. Now, in terms of emotional geographies, and this is not a term he uses, but it's a term that I use and others use, he looks at their implications for knowledge, for structures of sentiment, for the psyche, and for subjectivity. And he draws from post-colonial psychoanalytic theory to help explain various paradoxes in terms of the emotional geography of colonialism. And so it offers a number of different examples. One is the psychology of colonialism from the perspective of the colonizer. And this is a very fascinating instance because he says what the psychology of this was the practice of regarding people from the colonies as at an immature stage of development and of thus needing guidance from the colonising country to help them reach full maturity. This is a very infantilising, deficit approach to the psychology of these particular people. But he also talks about how these post-colonial scholars took psychoanalytic theory and rewrote it as part of as a weapon in the anti-colonial struggle. And I'm sure you have all heard of the work of Fanon, whose unbelievably stunning books, Black Skin, White Mask, and The Wretched of the Earth are the best well known. But part of this analysis of the psychology of the colonised identifies a number of different things with regard to that. At one end of the spectrum is an unconscious yearning for the coloniser's recognition, for the coloniser's support, recognition, praise, and all that sort of thing. At the other end is a form of what is talked about as psychic suffering, and accompanying that is a form of resentment, a resentment of the coloniser themselves. And the argument is that both coloniser and colonised, as Heike said the other day, constitute each other through these particular psychologies. And the argument also is that even despite post-colonial independence, or you might think of it in some cases as neo-colonial, not such greater independence, there is a lingering on of these particular subjectivities. So not only does he talk about the need for alternative practices of knowledge, geographies, but he also talks about the need for alternative emotional geographies as well. And he makes an argument for the need for new intellectual alliances, new solidarities that are centred in Asia, that shift the point of reference to Asia, that where people studying in Asia stop referencing the West and reference and talk with each other about Asia and parts of Asia together. And he calls this international localism. And he talks about the importance of what he calls interreferencing. So now to the students' project. In 210, there were 34 students. 34 people. Most were PhD students. There were 5 staff members, most of whom were from Asia. The students from Australia, Bangladesh, China, Indonesia, Iran, Malaysia, Mongolia, Pakistan, New Zealand, Saudi Arabia, Sri Lanka, Thailand and Vietnam. So it was a pretty wide-ranging group nationally. It was also wide-ranging in terms of the religion of the students, the different mother tongue languages of the students, and also the students were from different class backgrounds, not all middle class, as somebody implied earlier this week. Collectively also there were 13 universities involved because the students come from many different universities from their home country. Now the question that I want to address in this particular paper with regard to the students' project is, did the situation the students found themselves in at Monash resemble in any way Chen's colonised, imperialised space? Did the project exemplify any of the knowledge problems that Chen talks about? And did it go any way at all towards decolonising knowledge and subjectivity? So I'm just going to start by mentioning the cultural imaginary of the particular space of Monash, where the students came to. Typically at Monash, this is awful to say, but this is typical. Typically, the psychological processes that Chen talks about occur at Monash. Students are subjected to similar practices of infantilisation and similar deficit ways of thinking. The knowledge they bring with them is by and large ignored or downplayed, and this denies their full selfhood. Further, they're encouraged to use research sources. They're not encouraged to use sources from their home countries, particularly those sources that are not in English. They are usually steered towards the knowledge that their supervisors know, and this is usually from the UK or the USA. So invariably, and most of them conduct projects in their own countries, but they therefore are encouraged to read their own countries through Western eyes or through imperial eyes. This knowledge problem has been extremely well documented in Raewyn Connell's book called Southern Theory. Now, I acknowledge that some PhD supervisors do not do this. Some do get their students to engage with post-colonial theory, globalisation, comparative education and so forth, but this is by and large the exception rather than the rule. I should also point out that the relationships between international postgraduate students and their supervisors, the power relationships, are extremely asymmetrical. They pay exorbitant fees. They feel intense pressure to complete on time due to this or due to scholarships or visa requirements. They may be seeking work or permanent residency in the host country, but one of the greatest pressures is actually to read and write and think in English. Many of them have to undergo enormous amount of translation work in order to produce their PhDs in English, and this adds a considerable amount to what a local PhD student would have to do. So, but also, graduate students travel with a highly contradictory emotional luggage. This is not just about the flow of desire towards the West, as Chen talks about. It involves a whole lot of other aspirations. They bring with them national attachments, and this is when I'm talking about roots, ROOTS, that often become intensified when they are away from their home countries, as they struggle for self-definition and self-differentiation in these new places. They don't have an unconscious yearning for the colonizer's recognition necessarily, but in some ways the academic culture requires certain forms of self-negation and certain forms of mimicry. That's We can discuss that concept later. To adopt this pose may become a strategic choice of survival and progress. And in this way, both students and the institution constitute each other's subjectivity in highly asymmetrical ways. But the cultural imaginary that these particular students in this project inserted themselves into was obviously bigger than this. And in Australia at the time, there was a lot of evaluation about Australia's position in Asia, and this links back to your introduction. A policy document came out called Australia in the Asian Century, and it said this: "The Asian century is an Australian opportunity." Sounds like an advertising brochure, actually. "As the global centre of gravity shifts to our region, the tyranny of distance is being replaced by the prospects of proximity. Australia is located in the right place, at the right time, in the Asian region, in the Asian century." At the time also there was being rewritten the national curriculum for schools, and there was a lot of emphasis on Asian knowledge and culture and all that sort of stuff in the national curriculum, and I'll pick that up in a tick. So now to the questions: did the project exemplify any of the problems that Chen refers to, and did it go any way towards decolonising knowledge? Now, in some ways, it was a moment of intellectual decolonisation. It was student-led. Very few staff were involved, and none was in a leadership role. The project was an important moment of refusal, of self-assertion, and of self-differentiation. However, the students flocked to this book and this project like moths to a flame, and in the process they got so excited they fell into a number of the knowledge traps that Chen alerted people to. So first of all, they got very bogged down in the binary construction of East and West. So instead of elevating the West, they were elevating the East, buying precisely into that binary construction that is a problem in this knowledge space. Others didn't want to offend their host country, so instead of talking about Asia as method, they talked about dialogues between the two. Others fell into the problem of nativism and started talking about local wisdoms, pure and authentic Indigenous knowledges and so forth. And the most serious problem they fell into was nationalism, because they organised themselves by countries. So the students studying in Vietnam got together, the students studying in Asia, in China got together, and so on and so forth. So the alternative practices of identification that Chen argued for didn't happen immediately. And it wasn't until the students were putting their work out into the public sphere and getting peer-reviewed at conferences and getting subjected to critique from various other scholars in the space that they started to get involved in the serious work of self-critique, self-rediscovery, and so forth that Chen calls for. Now, some couldn't do it. Some were unable to do it, some didn't want to do it in the end, and so they withdrew from the project. And after that time, it was an incredibly intense emotional knowledge experience, and a number of anxieties emerged. And I'll just mention a couple of them. Some were about, this is too political. If I take this knowledge home, and I'm published in a book, I could get into trouble when I get back home. Another one was disciplinary territories, the territoriality of knowledge. And the students said, yes, but he's cultural studies, we're education, we're about things practical, we're not theoretical, this doesn't really apply to us. Another one, but overall, and as time went on, they sought to reconfigure their intellectual horizons and try to reimagine the discipline of education and its methodologies. And this put on the table some really interesting problems of knowledge translation across disciplinary spaces, as well as these historically constructed geographical spaces. The flow of desire went in many directions, not just a desire for the West. And the major one seemed to be the students really desperately they had a big aspiration to make a contribution while they were in Australia, and also to be able to take that home when they went home. They wanted to build a research community that imagined knowledge differently in a defiant way. This went beyond the sort of recognition issues that I alluded to earlier, because the project affirmed their Asianness. And in so doing, it spoke to the manner in which students from other/othered countries may develop deep affinities across nation states that they may not otherwise feel. So when they're in an international university, they very often cluster together as students from Asia, even if by and large when they're home they wouldn't be doing such clustering. So the project addressed these existing unsettled territorial sensibilities. But in many ways it also didn't go as far as Chen might have suggested in terms of decolonising knowledge. Because of the national organisation, they didn't do as much interreferencing as they might have. But initially the students felt very ignorant about each other's countries. And one of the good things was they learnt a lot more about each other's countries, but they also learnt about the problems of the ways in which knowledge is so spatially organised through the prism of the nation state. And they learnt about the importance of challenging methodological nationalism. So their points of reference shifted slightly towards what Chen talks about as international localism. It also raised lots of interesting questions in their minds, about the geopolitics of knowledge. So, for example, they wondered why they knew so much more about some countries than others. Why did they know so much more about certain things in certain countries than others? Why was religion such an important issue, regarded as such an important issue in Indonesia? How's my time going?
You have spoken for 26 minutes.
Okay, right. Okay. And they some of them pointed to Chen's failure to adequately take into account religion as an issue. And for example, the students who were from Bangladesh talked about the incredible importance of Islam in Bangladesh, and the ways in which Islam is significantly influences knowledge construction, and the religious mindset in relation to particularly questions of issues around the so-called war on terror, which is perceived as an attack against Islam. Nationalism was recognised as a problem by them eventually, and they talked a lot about how to get their headsets outside of having a nationalist mindset. But one of the intriguing things, and for me at least, who needs to know a lot more about Asia than I already know, people recounted stories not just about Western colonialism, but about the tensions and internal colonialisms within Asia itself. And there were a lot of very tense discussions about these particular sets of relationships between different countries in Asia. And very raw emotions were exposed. And ultimately, as a result of that, they suggested that Chen's project was somewhat utopian in its expectation that these things could be readily transcended. Now, an important ingredient, and this probably speaks to many people in this room, of Asia as method, is what Chen calls de-imperialisation. And this is a process whereby imperial powers in different parts of the world, including England, France, the Netherlands, Portugal, Spain, and the USA, not to mention various colonisers in Asia, rethink their own particular knowledge projects. And so here's a quote from him on that topic. The task, he says, is for the colonising or imperialising population to examine the conduct, motives, desires and consequences of the imperialist history that has formed their own particular subjectivity with regard to other countries in various colonised countries. And I have to say this process of de-imperialisation is one that I've found extremely daunting and extremely interesting to engage in. And I think it's probably been one of the most generative intellectual and political projects, knowledge projects that I've been involved in that sense. Now, the students wanted to de-imperialise the staff in the faculty. They wanted staff to decolonise their supervision practices. They wanted staff to de-imperialise their curriculum practices. They didn't take into account so much that Australia itself needs decolonising, because most Australians are constantly referencing UK knowledge, English-speaking knowledges in England or in the USA. So Australia, staff really needed to both decolonise and de-imperialise themselves. Now, even despite the fact that there was this giant push in Australian policy circles towards Asia, the Asian century and so forth, and the national curriculum, which you would have thought a teacher education faculty might get involved in, the de-imperialising stuff did not happen with any really of the other academic staff. Few members became involved, and when the students were presenting at conferences, by and large, the only people who came along, it's not that the numbers were they were considerable, but the people who came were largely people from Asia, by and large people from other parts of the world did not come along to these events. Now, the project's finished. The book is now with Routledge. In the end, 22 people stayed with the project and published with it, which isn't a bad survival rate over 3 years. Most of the students have gone back to their home countries, to their home universities, and are continuing the project in their own particular locations. So to conclude, back to the contemporary university as a global place of flows. I've offered an example of the manner in which the flows of people, knowledge and emotion intersect. I've shown how, in this instance, these flows come up against the forces for stasis and also in the university itself and also in student psyches. And I've shown how power-knowledge relationships were implicated via various manifestations of roots and roots. I conclude that Chen's framework is quite useful as a way of interpreting the cultural imaginary of this particular knowledge space, and I've illustrated how that is the case. I think it is particularly fruitful in thinking about the problems of various versions of colonialism, post-colonial scholarship, and how they can actually reconfirm the problems that they're intending to subvert. But the case study also points to some of the limitations of Chen's analytic. One example is the restricted reading of the emotional geography of the encounter, because it doesn't just run along a continuum from resentment at one end to desire for the colonizer's approval on the other. It's more complex than that. As the students unpacked their emotional luggage, it became clear that their emotional investments were much more nuanced and arose from a range of different other sources, including disciplinarity and a rather defensive nationalism. Such rooted territoriality is a force for stasis in the global place of knowledge, in the place of global knowledge flows, one that I think makes the forging of new intellectual alliances and solidarities through an Asia as method approach difficult, but not impossible, as this project begins to show. Thank you.